Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a frontline update for the Ukraine war for the 19th of January 2023. And here is the frontline we're going to be talking about. As ever, we'll start in the northeast, which is Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna. I've given you a news update already with the figures lost and all that, and news about military aid. Please go and check that out. That came out earlier today. Before we go to the front lines, let's look at DEFMON's shelling heat map. And it actually shows an intensification of artillery activity. Now, we don't know which side is responsible for this, arguably both, but certain areas will be one side shelling more than the other. We know, for example, that, as you can see from this map, there's a lot more activity north of Svatove, which is interesting. So, uh, to give you some meat on the bones there, in the last day, and this is from the Ukrainian the head of Kharkiv Regional Military Administration, saying Kupiansk, Dvorichna, Vovchansk, Krasna, Kamyanka, Chuhunivka, Tabaivka, and other cities and villages of the region were under Russian artillery and mortar fire. So these are all towns and villages in the Kupiansk area and further down. So around here, Dvorichna, all over the shop, there was shelling from the Russians. But the main bit of news, and that shelling is hot all the way down the Kupiansk to Kreminna front line, and then all the way down Donetsk, and then all the way over Zaporizhia, right to almost the city of Zaporizhia. So just a huge amount of shelling going on. So if we go to my map, a lot of talk, not too much in terms of troops movements. The Ukrainians are apparently fighting towards Orlanska again, a place that I haven't heard mentioned for some time. So the AFU says no reports is still conducting some operations near Kislivka towards Orlyanska. Russian forces pulled reinforcements to Tarasivka. So this is around this kind of area, just north of Svatova and Tarasivka there. So pulling reinforcements from behind the lines to there, I presume that's what it means, rather than pulling, you know, troops from out of in the fight. I guess that they wouldn't be reinforcements then. Use your brain, Pierce. So as we come further down south, we have even Russians admitting that Ukrainians have control of Novosibirsk. The very generous Syriac map here saying that they have recaptured most of the town of Novosibirsk, the Ukrainians, after expanding the Russian army in the LPR towards the train station. Battle for the town continues. That's something I don't see very often, which is a blue section of the map for Syriac map, indicating that the Ukrainians have gained some ground. And War Monitor said Ukrainian forces have made some important advances around Novosibirsk and Kolomychika. The advances are not massive, but of strategically important value, and in the future will open greater opportunities of a breakthrough. This is undoubtedly correct, because if you don't, gain ground around here, Kolomychika, Kuzmivka, then you're not going to get Svatova, and they want to encircle Svatova, and it seems to have taken them an awful long time over recent weeks to get anywhere in particular. It's something of a stalemate up and down this line. And stalemate doesn't mean they're not doing anything. There's obviously going to be fierce fighting. However, it does appear that the Russians are making some gains in the Ploshchanka area. So we go to the Institute for the Study of War. They say that geolocated footage published on January 18th indicates that Russian forces have made marginal advances south of Ploshchanka. So that's going to be in this river gully area just to the south of there that I've talked to you about before. You can see there's a kind of river gully here, and there is another one to the west. So they have got onto the higher ground here, I believe, and are making advances westwards. So that's not great for the Ukrainians. The Luhansk Oblast head Serhiy Haidai, so Ukrainian, stated on January 18th that Russian forces attempted to counterattack near Kreminna, but the Russian forces are unlikely to launch a counteroffensive in the area in the near future. Interesting, because there's been so much talk about where this counteroffensive is going to come from the Russians, and there's been some claims that they are building up forces possibly south of Kreminna. So there could be this larger encirclement of Seversk from, if they can take Bakhmut, then they can come up from a southerly direction and then from a northerly direction from Kreminna and take a big chunk of this territory off around Seversk. That's one prevailing theory for the Russian counterattack, but we're just not sure. Haidai saying it's not going to happen around the Kreminna area, so I don't know. Uh, Haidai also stated that the Russian forces are transferring equipment to the other side of the Krasna River, which flows through Kreminna in preparation for defensive operations, and they're continuing to move reserves to the Svatove Kreminna line, indeed, military equipment and reserves to Severodonetsk. So, just to remind you, Severodonetsk is there, just to the southeast of Kreminna. So, this would suggest it depends what you mean by a counter-offensive not going to happen near Kreminna. I mean, how near is near? What's interesting and worth a little look is the River Krasna. So, the Krasna does go through. Kreminna here, so you can see it there. And there's been some talk, in fact, Defmon did an analysis of this recently, saying that it's likely that the Russians are going to be pushed back behind the Krasna River, and they'll take a defensive stance there rather than fight particularly hard, maybe for this area of Kreminna, and use the river as a kind of natural barrier. And that river goes up and goes through all these settlements like Krasnoyarchenska and further north. That river, the Ukrainians did when they did their lightning quick counteroffensive, they did actually reach Krasnoyarchensk some time back, and they did even get a foothold to the east of the Krasno River. But now look how much land the Ukrainians have subsequently lost in that area. Of course, it wasn't solidly controlled by them, but they did have a foothold there, and now they're struggling around Chervona Popivka somewhat. However, let's have a look at some of those claims. Let's go to Defmon says the Ukrainians still have the initiative in this area. This is the Luhansk Oblast. Russian forces are mostly defending. Most active areas are northwest of Svatove, which I've just shown you, and northwest and southwest of Kreminna. I believe Chervona Popivka is the key for the Ukrainians to take. Absolutely no argument from me there at all. Yeah, it's just to continue what Noel Reports was saying. North of Kreminna, the Ukrainians are developing. Despite geolocated footage of the Russian forces in Dubrova, the area is AFU dominant. Russia mainly strikes Kuzmina Dubrova by hit and run attacks, with small attack groups under armored cover. Battles last for 1 to 2 hours and then they retreat. So Noel Reports have been talking about this stuff going on in Kreminna, but then the details just haven't come out, and you wonder whether things are really going on there or not. But he's talking about their Dubrova, which some people are now saying is under Russian control. It could be just hit and runs, and maybe that's just a bit of a grey area. I didn't change my map because possibly I should move my Ukrainian lines further back here. This is possibly just a large grey area, but but as Noel Report says, I mean, he says that Ukrainians are dominant around here, and Russians get by with these hit and run attacks. Anyway, as we come further down south, we move on to Bilorivka. So apparently the Ukrainians repelled a Russian attack around Bilorivka. That's been going on for some time there. But there's been some movement around Spirna now. Here is my map, but actually Suryat Maps, again, pro-Russian source, is being rather generous and saying that the situation on the northeast front, the Russian army and DPR forces continue advancing towards the town of Rozdilivka. That's further down south near Solidar. In addition, the recent shelling of Russian artillery south of Spirna confirms Ukrainian army has taken these positions recently. So there's you got Spirna just to the north and Brestova there. So according to this source, the Ukrainians have some kind of presence in this area. So I might move my maps to reflect that, see if I hear anything else about that. But that's only going to be marginal gains to the south of Spirna. And then we get on to Bakhmut. So the reality of what's going on in the Bakhmut area, certainly over the last day, is that there seems to be a huge stabilization. In fact, I've not changed my maps at all here, which is great news for the Ukrainians and could be this indication that the Russians really are kind of culminating. They don't have, because if you were the Russian command at the moment, you'd think, right, that success in Solidar really should lead on to this a gathering momentum that allows the Russians to punch through the defensive lines across this highway, across this road, and then to come behind Bakhmut from the north, and at the same time take Klishchivka and hit Ivanivska and cut off this road to the to the, I guess, to the west. And that encirclement, you would imagine. I mean, goodness me, people pro-Russians in my threads were saying, "Oh, it's going to be dominoes," and then before you know it, it'll be Kramatorsk and then Kiev. Literally like that. Oh, it's that easy, is it? Um, but actually, they're struggling to get past the defensive lines that have been set up by SIL. There's fighting around all of these places: Krasnopolivka, Blahadatny, Krasnohora, Paraskovivka, Pidorodny, but no real sort of movement. So if we look at what people say here, so Defmon says the Ukrainians have repulsed attacks in all of those areas I just said, and Klishchivka. It seems Klishchivka is a main focus now for the Russian forces. I've not really seen any major movement for the last week or so. That will be in terms of Klishchivka. In the Solidar area up north, no report says no map changes. Russian forces attacking towards all those places I've said. All attacks were repelled. Russian forces complain about the losses in Solidar due to the lack of artillery support. So that's fascinating. And there has been this talk that actually the artillery has really slowed down recently. Do they have supply issues? Do they have manufacturing issues? There are two issues going on here: logistics, the getting the munitions they do have, and then the other issue is, do they have those munitions? So two issues going on there, made difficult by HIMARS and made difficult by just running out of ammunition, and so on and so forth. So yeah, a lack of artillery support has definitely been recognised in the area. The rate of fire has really dropped, and now Ukrainians are reporting that Russians are complaining about that. Rebar says not too much, all things considered, about the Bakhmut area, considering previously it's been like endless reports about what's going on. You've now basically got three tweets. Wagner assault units are fighting in the area of Razdalivka and Krasnopilia, pushing the enemy further from Solidar after liberating Sol Station. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence they have pushed further at all. North of Bakhmut, clashes continue. Yep. Near Paraskovivka and Krasnohora, movement is complicated by a network of enemy strongholds. So this would be true. So there's a lot of trenches that have been built recently and over time in the whole area, I guess. But we've seen trenches that the Russians have occupied that have been hit by Ukrainian artillery. I won't show you the footage of that, but in this area, there I've seen lots of Russian casualties as they are in the trenches, but the Ukrainians are in their networks as well, and these are providing difficult obstacles to overcome for the Russians, as admitted by Rebar there. Russian troops are fighting in the urban sector of Bakhmut. The AFU, trying to prevent the surrender of the city, is moving reinforcements to Chaziv Yar in order to slow down the Russian offensive. Yep, I presume that is true. South of Bakhmut, heavy fighting continues in Klishivka. The liberation of the settlement will make it possible to establish fire control over the Chaziv Yar Bakhmut highway and cut off Bakhmut from the south. This is interesting. So they said that for something like 4 days in a row, right? Which is this part, which is just like, well, yeah, we know how useful it is. What would they actually done? And of course, it's just heavy fighting continues. They haven't done anything. My idea of what's going on in Klishchivka is that there is fighting, but that nothing has been going for the Russians. However, ISW says a Russian mill blogger claimed that Wagner Group fighters attempted to advance to the western outskirts of Klishchivka and are engaged in fierce battles with the Ukrainian forces near the settlement. Sorry, I forgot to say what Noel Report says, because there's a few interesting things here. So going back to Bakhmut, Russian forces are entrenched themselves east of Bakhmut, just outside the Zabamutka district. So that's on the eastern suburbs. They're entrenched there now. They are being targeted by reinforced Ukrainian artillery units. Units in Bakhmut received a big supply of drones and Starlink communication systems. That could be vital for the Ukrainian defense. Klishivka holds, due to what I said yesterday, a good amount of reserves have been pulled to north of it. A certain artillery and armor brigade is doing an amazing job. We didn't look so good a few days ago, and it looks much better now. Russian keep attacking to the northeast and southwest. If I go back to my map, so really no movement in the north, no movement in the east either. None in the sort of suburbs around the garbage disposal plant or the waste sorting plant. No real news of Opitny either. and it's Klishchivka. Now, if that's true, a Russian military blogger saying they're fighting on the western outskirts of Klishchivka, then that would indicate that the Russian line has advanced through Klishchivka and that the Ukrainians are holding on to the west. Well, I've got no other claim to that degree, even from the Russian sources that I use. So I would say that's probably not the case, and in fact, we're seeing that at the moment, at least, the Russians appear to have come to a bit of a standstill with regards to the Ukrainian defenses. I don't know whether they will pile in more and more resources, personnel into this area. I would completely predict that. Uh, I think that Russia really need this win in Bakhmut, and although they had some great success over the last week, I think it will get more difficult from now because the Ukrainians are piling in their own reinforcements into the area. You've got their Kraken forces working Klishchivka, which are special forces operations. You've got artillery working really effectively. And just to show you this, these are Humvees with tow missile systems, which can fire up to sort of 4-5 kilometers and take out these are effective missile systems. And those are operating in the Bakhmut area. The Russians, on the other hand, appear to be, I mean, this is typical. This is in Bakhmut.
Let's get in here.
Our camera on the car dashboard captured the moment two of what's believed to have been 120mm mortars slammed into a residential building across the street. The force of the blast broke the windscreen.
Wow. So that's Al Jazeera filming that and reporting there. So that is what they're doing, which is mortar attacks. So they are close. They're mortar attacking inside Bakhmut. Bakhmut isn't like, say, Marinka, and we'll come on to look at some footage in Marinka, which is completely gutted and destroyed. Bakhmut is kind of still hanging on there as a almost functioning town. And maybe that shows that the Russians just don't have the artillery in the area to do that. Maybe don't have the munitions, haven't been able to get close enough. Whatever the reason is, uh, they Bakhmut still stands to a large degree. But it is interesting seeing that, and you wonder whether Russia will then go back to doing what they've done in the past, which is flattening places and then walking in. But it's certainly not what's going on at the moment. Anyway, that's the front line for the Bakhmut area. I guess good news for the Ukrainians in comparison to what the last week has seen, and it is possible that the Russians are starting to culminate, but I guess we'll see over the next few days. And the last thing to say on that, this comes from ISW. The Russian MOD's use of, quote, volunteers of assault detachments, close quote, to describe the formations that supposedly captured Sil likely refers to Wagner Group fighters. It goes on to talk about how you've got this internal issue going on between Prigozhin and Wagner and the Russian MOD, and the Russian MOD don't want to give props to the Wagner, and Wagner is saying, hey, we're responsible for all the gains here. And in fact, ISW do a large analysis at the beginning of their daily report, which is well worth a read. This could well be becoming a big problem. Prigozhin is being more and more outspoken against almost the Russian administration, and that probably doesn't augur well for Prigozhin going forward. This could be an issue, and hey, as a pro-Ukrainian, you've got to love it when the Russians start eating themselves up. Going on to Avdivka, there really isn't an awful lot to report of Avdivka, just repelled fighting in a lot of the normal places. So we come down south here to Avdivka, passing Horlivka, New York, Toretsk. We come to north of Avdivka, Kamyanka, so there was a repelled Russian attack there. Also repelled attacks in Vodyanye, Novelska just down here. So again, the usual culprits involved there, but nothing else to say particularly until we get to Marinka, repelled attack in Pobyeda, Now, Marinka's a little bit interesting. Let's go to some of our sources. So, no report says the AFU have repelled attacks in Marinka, Pobieda, just to the south, and Novomykhailivka, which is further south again. Near Avdivka, Russian forces were repelled in near Kamianka. Yep, geolocated footage confirmed Ukrainian presence in the center of Marinka, despite the claims of Russian forces that they pushed back the Ukrainian forces. And that's what I said yesterday. It's absolutely ridiculous that they're claiming that they pushed them within 300 meters of the western outskirts. So yesterday's claim from the Russians, if you didn't see it, were that they were pushing the Ukrainians out from basically here. Knowing how long that it's taken Russia to get where they have in this area, to think that in one day they would suddenly have this amount of land is absolutely ridiculous. It's never going to happen. So there's geolocated footage of fighting going on in the center, which is exactly what I predicted, that it's no different from what it has been. There is a report in the ISW that they have tried to cut a road. Russian forces attempted to cut a road that runs through part of Ukrainian-controlled Marinka. This is actually from War Gonzo. Here, their telegram. There's a section of the road, so it's really vague here. There is a section of the road which also passes through part of Marinka, controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine. An attempt to cut it was unsuccessful. City fighting continues in Marinka itself. So again, that's pretty much acceptance that fighting is still going on in the center of Marinka. Again, I like to do this, which is to give you a sense of a place rather than just have it understood as lines on a map or pins on a map. Here is Marinka, and this is a recent piece of drone footage to give you some kind of visual understanding of the destruction involved in such a place. I've turned the sound off, but it's just it's incredible. So this footage really hits home how destructive war is. I mean, this is a proper apocalyptic hellscape. Everything turns to grey. The color it's like it's drained out of a place like this. All life is extinguished. There's no living tree. There's no flower or grass. There's just nothing. It's just different shades of grey. Yeah, that is Marinka. And that goes on. Just a very evocative piece of footage. And just goes to show as well just how important drones are these days, just for everything. When you're watching a movie and you see an aerial piece of footage, that used to be filmed by a helicopter, having to charter a helicopter and do that. Now you can put a 4K camera on a drone, send it up there, and you can get exquisite footage. And this is obviously a completely different context, but this gives you, I wouldn't say it's exquisite, it's heartrending and heartbreaking, and yeah, it's the sadness of war, right? As we move on, there isn't again too much to report on the rest of the front lines. So as we come out, zoom out, and go along the Zaporizhia front line, the rest of the Donetsk front line is relatively quiet. But there has been some activity along the Zaporizhia front line, particularly near Hulaypol. So Defmon says Ukrainian General Staff have said that Russians carried out unsuccessful offensive operations in the Orokhiv and Hulaypol directions. So that's there and there, just to let you know. Well, actually, the ISW says Ukrainian officials have indicated that Russian forces are concentrating in Zaporizhia Oblast, possibly for a large defensive or offensive effort. Interesting. They reported that Russian forces conducted unspecified offensive actions in those two areas, I just said. An inflection from the General Staff's normal reporting of the Zaporizhia Zaporizhia Oblast front. So, yeah, there is an uptick in activity around there, which isn't particularly normal. And then they go on to sort of discuss whether the Russian forces are actually doing getting ready for a big offensive, because This is one theory. Other Ukrainian officials have recently reported that Russian forces are transporting large convoys of military personnel, equipment, and defensive fortifications along critical logistics lines through Zaporizhia Oblast. Ukrainian Kherson Oblast military administration advisor Klan stated that Russian forces train mobilized personnel on the Arabat Spit in Crimea and then transport them to unspecified areas east, which could include Zaporizhia Oblast. So the idea, some are claiming it's offensive, some are claiming they're doing defensive, and there is one piece of the puzzle to say that actually they could be just preparing from defensive work because the Ukrainians themselves are getting ready for a counteroffensive. Is that on January 13th, it was claimed that new pro-Russian volunteers from Serbia arrived in Zaporizhia Oblast to quote defend the front lines. So their idea of what they're doing there is to defend the front lines. Then actually the activity around there is defensive rather than offensive, as the ISW goes on to say. This is likely the Russians realizing that Ukrainians really do want to do an offensive around here. Not sure whether that will be, through Polohy or down through Tokmak towards Melitopol, down to Berdyansk, or there is some claiming that it's going to Mariupol through Volnovakha, which would be pretty sensible because it cut these supply lines all the way to the west. Uh, or some are claiming that it could be two offensives, from one from Zaporizhia, one from sort of southern Donetsk here, in towards Mariupol. So the Russians are clearly taking that into account and upping their defenses around there. As far as news elsewhere, I have no particular news about the front line in Kherson other than just consistent shelling along the Dnipro River. Yeah, and again, Marinets and Nikopol get hit on a nightly basis. As you can see here, the Euromaidan press today reporting that Russians hit Nikopol district again with MLRS, so multiple launch rocket systems. More than 30 shells hit Chervonohorovivka and Marinets communities, damaging homes. According to preliminary data, no one was injured. So just to let you know, this is in that area, Nikopol, Marinets, and around there that they just get hit repeatedly. Anyway, yeah, no particular news about Crimea or anywhere else behind the lines. I'm sure there will be your usual hits on certain targets. Anyway, thank you. That's a Frontline update. Please like, subscribe, and share. There are all the ways you can support the channel in the description below. And I will hopefully catch you later for an extra. Doodle pips.